Hello, hello. This is Spencer McGrill, and we are going to keep the pain train rolling with my second video I'm recording today. I'm trying to do as little work, as little editing as possible. This is a website I used to go to a lot called the Alternative Hypothesis. It was run by a guy named Ryan Falk. Um, I don't. People have told me that's not his real name. That's the only name I know him by. This website is gone. I DM'd him once on Twitter, I think, and asked him, about his website being down. He mentioned it was on webarchive.org. I don't trust webarchive.org. They've gotten rid of a lot of sites that cover like controversial topics like, race, and they talk. So I'm worried that his work, which I think is excellent, is going to kind of fall into the ether. And he does have some contemporaries, but I figure as a fan and maybe just as a function of internet historianism as an internet historian to chronicle the internet history, I would try to read some of these articles because I don't know if anyone ever read a lot of his stuff. I think that people watched his videos, and his videos are great. I like to go through some of his videos too, and just I don't know. I guess I would just be nodding my head in agreement to a lot of his observations. But yeah, he mostly focused on racial research, and I figured I'd just read one of his articles. So this is the first article on his WordPress site that he did. There were actually his stuff was reposted on another website. I can't remember what it was called. The Right articles or something. I can't, or the alternate right or something. But this is the one that I read his stuff on initially. Um, so here we go. I'll try to say less. This is only my second video, so let me. And I'm Spencer McGreal, by the way. You can like and subscribe. I don't know. I don't think this will be posted on YouTube because I think things were. This is why Stefan Molyneux got kicked off YouTube because I don't think you can talk about genetic racial differences on YouTube without getting kicked off. You can talk about pretty much anything else, but not this. So ethnic diversity and social cohesion. Summary. Research shows that people like those who are similar to them. Moreover, the more heritable a trait is, the more important similarity in it is to friends and spouses. Thus, people enjoy the company of those who are genetically similar to them. This may explain why people to marry, befriend, and live near members of their own race far more than randomness would predict. Moreover, a rich literature correlational, longitudinal, and experimental data shows that people get along better with members of their own race and that ethnic diversity damages social cohesion. I don't know if it's going to talk about it, but there was a book years ago called Bowling Alone. And I remember Vincent James of the Red Elephants would talk about this book a lot. And it talked about the fall in third spaces, right? So your first space is your home, second space is work, third space is like a bar or a bowling alley you would go to, and that's what the name of the book was based on, is that people bowl alone now where they used to bowl in bowling leagues. And you can see this with more diverse um, communities, right? Like just neighborhoods that have different racial groups that they tend not to talk as much. They tend not to lean over the fence and chit chat with their neighbor as much. Let me check the timer, make sure we're working good. Um, and so that is kind of what they're referring to. Um, yeah, people like people who are similar to them. Oh, and this is also, I don't know if he's going to get into this either, but this is also why I'm not super concerned with mixed race. People talk about miscegenation, which is racial mixing and then producing racially mixed children. So like theoretically, right, the white race would go extinct if all white women had sex with like black men or Asian men, right? The child, our race is very fragile in terms of, the physical characteristics being subsumed by other racial characteristics. But that the data I've seen is that it's below, well below like 11% and falling. So, you know, I just think that online maybe people make a big deal out of it, but I haven't seen a lot of evidence that there's a lot of race mixing going on in diverse areas. It's more in diverse areas, right? Like if you live closer to Chicago or Detroit, just places where black people are, like in the United States, you're going to see it more. But throughout the majority of the country, you're not going to see mixed race couples or mixed race, people. I know a couple mixed race young gentlemen, and I actually just met a lady who had mixed race children with her husband, who was black. Okay, people like people who are similar to them. If you take a class in social psychology, one of the first things you'll learn is that people like people who are similar to themselves. Similar people get along better, make better friends, and better marriage partners. This viewpoint is supported by two kinds of evidence, correlational and experimental. The correlational evidence consists of repeated findings that friends and spouses are more similar in just about every way imaginable than average. Moreover, the more similar spouses are, actually, I should check to make sure his um, links still work. I think they do, except for the links that were broken at the time of the web capture. I remember I did, Stefan Molyneux did years ago, he did a video that I really liked. It was about, it was like Jon Stewart versus Bill O'Reilly on white privilege. And all the links in that video were broken. I went through and relinked all of them on my own site. And that site's down too now. But yeah, this one links to a book. All right. Moreover, anyway, I guess I could do that on here if one of these links don't work. I already know one of them doesn't work on another article that I was looking at of his, but I think on the very heavily information articles, they are all still contained. Moreover, the more similar spouses are, the more satisfied they tend to be with their marriage, and the less likely they are to get a divorce. Right? You have high divorces among mixed race groups, which is interesting too, because I wonder if that's just covering what's going on. I wonder if that's just covering heterosexual marriage, because the other thing we know is that having a female in the relationship is the highest chance of a divorce occurring, right? So lesbians have a very high divorce rate, whereas gay men do not have a high divorce rate at all. Um, let's see. Moreover, spouses are more similar. They tend to be between marriages and less likely to get divorced. The experimental evidence is pretty straightforward. Researchers measure various traits of individuals before they meet and then see whether the pre-meeting similarities predict who they end up liking. The finding repeated over dozens of studies is that more similar people the more similar people are, the more they end up liking each other. These findings contradict the idea of opposites attract and make a lot of intuitive sense. If someone doesn't like to do the same activities as you, doesn't have the same sense of humor as you, etc., why wouldn't you be less likely to like them? Yeah, I don't know if opposites attract it's not a scientific thing. It's just something people say for some reason. I think my experience with couples growing up is that I don't know if that this has been my experience personally. I think my experience personally has been more that you have to have a same goal, right? If your goal is to work hard, buy a big house, then that keeps people together, right? And you're having good sexual intercourse. And if your goal is to raise a family, that keeps people together too. Um, so yeah, similar goals, and I guess that would lead to similar activities or liking similar things. Oh, my parents have very different likes and wants, but they are together and they have a very happy marriage. People like people who are genetically similar to them. Perhaps less obvious than the fact that similarity breeds attraction is the role that genetics plays in this. Specifically, both friends and marriage partners are more genetically similar than average. One thing, I don't think he mentions this in this article, but I remember there was research showing that one of the problems with diversity and social cohesion is that the traits that the genetic traits of a certain group of people are actually downplayed when they're around a genetic people that are genetically dissimilar from them, right? And I know this is true with Asians, that Asians behave differently in groups of all Asians than they do in a mixed racial group. So they're more friendly, more jovial, and then when they're around a group just of all white people, they're not trying to act white necessarily. They're just, well, what does that mean, act white, right? But everything's just more subdued in terms of the traits that you would express as Asian traits. And people say the same thing about whites, blacks, whatever. Okay, now you might think this is to be expected since such friends and spouses are more phenotypically similar than the average. Phenotype just means your physical characteristics expressed through your genes, right? So like you dyeing your hair wouldn't be phenotypical, but being like a redhead would be a phenotype, or white. And of all phenotypes are partially heritable. There is more to it than that. The more heritable a trait is, the more similar friends and spouses tend to be in it. That's really interesting. And this is Rushton. I have a couple books by Ruston. He's a very influential researcher. Gets a couple things wrong, but his data is invaluable, especially because a lot of people don't talk about this stuff because it tends to, I don't know, get them fired. People tend not to decide whether something's true based on data. They tend to do it based on whether they're going to get yelled at. So you kind of need people that are very like autistic and like focused on like the data and stuff in order to kind of suss out whether something's true. Moreover, similarity in highly heritable traits is a better predictor of marital marital success than similarity in less heritable traits. Further still, if you ask someone to imagine a person who is similar to them in various ways, the more heritable a trait involved in similarities, the more that person will predict that they will like that person that they are imagining. So one of the things that is, and I don't think he goes into it in this study, but I remember there was a study that showed that the heritable traits even comes down to the width of your wrist, right, is determined by your genetics, and you can actually measure people's width of wrists with their partners, and the closer it is, that more heritable trait predicts a better outcome. Let's see, and see, like, you need something like a wrist, right? Like something like that is to your that isn't super different based on it being a man or woman, right? Like you wouldn't measure your hips, right? Because women have different size hips than guys, or like cranial capacity, right? Or the person's head, because women have smaller heads than men. People of the same race are more similar than average. So people do not get along with people who are similar to them. They especially get along better with people who are genetically similar to them. Now let's relate this to race. People of the same race are on average more genetically similar than people of different races. In fact, if you measure a large enough portion of the genome, the probability that a same race pair of people will be more genetically similar than a different race pair of people nears 100%. As is covered elsewhere on this site, the races also differ in terms of demographic values, psychological variables, physiological variables, and political views. Given this, on average, members of the same race can be expected to be more similar than members of different races on just about any given measure. Given these two facts, we might expect that people would tend to marry and befriend members of their own race, and we'd be right. Most marriages and friendships are between members of the same race. For instance, Ingram, 2014, reported on a study done by Public Religion Institute, which found the following. The average white American has one black friend, one Latino friend, one Asian friend, one mixed race friend, one other race friend, friends of unknown races. We'll never know. Oh, and they have 91 white friends. It's funny. For me, I think that it's funny, one black friend, it really just determines on where you grew up. I grew up on the south side of Chicago, where it was much more diverse, and so I had a lot of black friends. And also my interests tended to lean towards like anime and video games, and those kind of activities aren't particularly racial specific. Whereas some people might say something like tennis tends to lean more white. The average black American has 83 black friends. Also, this is funny because now people don't have friends at all. So it's kind of this is a large friend group. These are like people that are like working, going out in the world that aren't at home, addicted to video games. 8 white friends, 2 Latino friends, 0 Asian friends. That's interesting because there's a lot of black and Asian violence in the cities. 3 mixed race friends, 1 other race friend, and 4 friends of unknown race. I think it's hilarious, the friends of unknown race. They're just a mystery meat person. who, who, what race are you? Let me check my recording. Okay, good. 15 minutes. Let's try to wrap this up. Similarly, according to a report by Pew, among adults who are white with no other race in their background, fully 81% say that all or most of their close friends are white. Among single-race blacks, 70% say that all or most of their close friends are black. And among single-race Asians, 54 say all or most of their close friends are Asian. Some of the reports, which were based on census data, found that 88% of new marriages in America are to members of the same race. People's racial preferences don't stop at those close relationships either. Studies also show significant racial segregation in terms of neighborhoods people live in and the churches they attend. Moreover, preferences for members of their own race begin to appear in infancy. And I think I'll cover another one later that babies are racist, that babies prefer members of their own race, and that they look away from different racial groups quicker, and they tend to steer longer at races of their own genetic background. Churches, it's funny because Louis Farrakhan's Nation of Islam, which is a black nationalist group, was actually operating. It's been operating since the 70s, 80s, whenever it started. It was like it was like 15 minutes, 20 minutes away from my house. So you literally have like churches that preach racial hatred against white Europeans, like just down the street, you know. But of course, you know, you get yelled at for using the N word, but they're able to preach all the racial hate they want. I think ethnic diversity kills social cohesion. So people tend to get along with people who are similar to them, like co-ethnics. Yo, my co-ethnic. What's up? What's up, my co-ethnic? People typically befriend and marry co-ethnics, live near co-ethnics, and go to church with co-ethnics. And this preference for co-ethnics begins to form in the first few months of life. Co-ethnics. In other words, co-ethnics. No, in other words, left to their own devices, people primarily associate with members of their own race and or co-ethnics. Given this, it shouldn't be surprising that a wealth of social science evidence shows that ethnic diversity hurts the degree to which people get along. Most of the most well-known study in this literature is Putman. Putman. This is the guy who did Bowling Alone. Putman, a Harvard political science, analyzed a set of 40 regions across the United States and looked at how ethnic diversity related to various measures of social capital. He built a regression model that held regional differences in age, poverty, crime, and other variables consistent, and found the more ethnically diverse region was lower levels of social capital. Ethnic diversity, a region was, sorry, found that the more ethnically diverse a region was, the lower its level of social capital was. In particular, Putman found the most diverse a community was, the less trust residents reported having in their neighbor, the less people trusted local government and media, and the less people voted, the less people gave to charity, the less people worked on community projects, and the fewer friends people had. Something that I think is interesting is the left wing tends to push a lot of diversity, right? They tend to be anti-white and not want, at least in this country, in the United States, and they tend to, want mixed areas, but they also want unions. And this data also corresponds, I know, to unions, where there's unions are less strong when they're more diverse. And unions aren't always the best outcome of determining like increase in wages to begin with, right? The Milton Friedman, was it Friedman or Rothbard? It might have been Rothbard, Murray Rothbard, my two favorite Jews. Um, he did a talk on unions based on a study that he did, and he talked about how it was the highest paid unions, and he wasn't studying racial diversity, but it turns out the one that had the best predictor for increasing wages was actually the airline union. So if you're an airline pilot and you're part of a union, which I guess they're all part of unions, that seems the most that union fights for the most pay increases, whereas the poorest people in unions, that's just money just being funneled to the unions, and there's little to no corresponding to like the union using that money to increase the people's wages. But I guess if I were to think about it, most airline pilots are, at least in the U.S., white males. And yeah, also I'll get into this later, but it's also important to remember that white males are a minority, right? Not in the continental U.S. yet; they will be soon. But well, actually, no, they are, because there are more females now than males in the U.S. Um, yeah, but in terms of worldwide, whites are only about like 8% of the population of the world. So perhaps most strikingly, people in diverse communities were less happy overall and less satisfied with their lives. Lawrence and Bentley, 2015, replicated Putnam's findings in England. And it's also worth noting that Putnam, I don't think he gets into this in an article, but Putnam withheld his findings. I think, yeah, 2007, he withheld it for years. I think this was done like, it might have been done like in the 90s. And he was just so nervous about publishing his findings. Maybe I'm confusing with a different researcher, but I'm pretty sure that was him. And sometimes these researchers that want to stay politically correct in the good graces of the tyrannical left, they want to find a way to spin their studies so that they can put a positive diversity spin on it, right? And I guess he couldn't figure out a way to do it. The findings were so stark that he's just like, I have to publish them as is. And now you see less of these, right? You notice that some of these are going back like over a decade. Now, especially the people online are talking about these and spreading this information around, less and less of the stuff is getting published in actual journals, right? They're too careful. They don't want information that goes against their cultural and political narrative getting out. They just want you to believe what they want you to believe. So they'll downplay anything that's negative about diversity because they don't want people thinking. Well, let's be honest. They don't want white people thinking as an organized group. They don't care about other groups doing it. We have the NAACP, right? And Louis Farrakhan has been able to operate his racist church for as long as he wants. Islam acts as a racial vanguard for, I guess, Middle Eastern or Islamic people. So replicate Putnam's finding in England and utilized data on an 18-year period. Found that more diverse a neighborhood became, the less people reported liking their neighborhood and engaging with their neighbors. Similar, Lawrence and Dunkers, 2008, looked at social capital and ethnic diversity within the Netherlands. They utilized data from a Danish survey which asked questions about how much people trusted their neighbors in controlling for differences in gender, education, attainment, and marital status income. The study found that more ethnically diverse a person's postal code was, learn to talk, the less they trusted, the less trust they had in their neighbors. To be fair, not all studies turn out this way. Mir and 2014 meta-analysis of 90 previous papers and found that 50% of the studies carried out in the U.S. replicated Putnam's finding, while 20% failed to do so. The remaining 30 were classified as having offered mixed evidence. By contrast, only 28% of studies in Europe replicated Putnam's findings, while 50% failed to do so, and the remaining 59% studies offered mixed evidence. Europe's interesting because Europe's really become much more non-white in the last decade, and you have those really high profile stories like the Nottingham rape crisis that they were having, where Islamic men were raping white European females. I'll leave this up for just a minute. You can read this study, this from Mir and Tosman's meta-analysis if you want. The replication rates aren't great, but they're also easy to explain. First, many of the studies measured ethnic diversity in a way that would call it half white, half black neighborhoods, and half British, half American, half American German neighborhoods as equally diverse. Yeah, that's not super helpful when you're trying to study the colloquial biological races. And this is something that you'll notice a lot as we kind of go through different papers and books, is that people, first of all, people disagree on how many races there are, right? Like where would you draw the dividing lines, right? There isn't like a different genetic makeup. There are certainly genetic markers, but there's not like this is all blacks have this gene, all whites have this gene kind of situation most of the time. And people disagree about whether Jews are a race, separate from whites, whether there's enough genetic diversity there. So people will conflate these things like national origin with racial origin many times. As an ANCAP, if you watch my video, Introduction to Reality, you'll know that I don't think, nations exist in the abstract, but nations aren't as real as genetics. Genetics really exist. A people, a person, and their genetics influencing how they look and their outcomes and behavior exists. People's countries don't really exist, right? So there is a white people, right? But the U.S. is just kind of a zone that the elites kind of planned out and just threw a bunch of people in together. So like the term American doesn't really mean anything, where the term white does mean something. One of the reasons I'm not a racial nationalist. Um, More specifically, ethnic diversity was often measured as a probability that two people from the same region would be of different ethnic groups were the list of possible ethnic groups included not 3 to 4 races, but rather 100 plus ethnic groups. Wow. Thus, many of these studies looked at ethnicity rather than racial diversity, and it is problematic because ethnic groups are far more genetically and phenotypically similar than races are. You see this in the U.S., right, where they try to talk about immigration of white men of good character, where they can more easily kind of blend into the society of America. There's a great video. I think he has an article associated with it too, called "Conceived in White Nationalism." It's incredible. It's one of my favorite videos I think he's ever put out. When he talks about how it's a lie that the U.S. was supposed to be anything but a white country, um, and there's a lot of well, I'll go through it some other time. We can wait, or look it up yourself, or wait for me to read it to you with bated breath. The second problem with this meta-analysis is that many of the studies reference control for the mechanics by which ethnic diversity might damage social cohesion. For instance, studies controlled for income inequality and crime. The results of this analysis will be misleading because ethnic diversity might cause a decrease in social cohesion, thus causing an increase in crime and income inequality. Thus, many of these studies controlled for the effects of diversity and then concluded that diversity had no effect. Ha ha ha. The worst of these studies that actually controlled for racial diversity. For instance, Alswood and Penducker, 2005, and Anderson and Milakin, 2011, both found that proportions of neighborhood which is non-white negatively correlated to its level of social cohesion, but that ethnic diversity had no or a positive impact on social cohesion after controlling for more effects of variation in the size of the population that isn't white. Several of these studies are conducted as a failed replications by Mead and Tosman. So I mean, this is kind of a little bit of a just so story, right? Where he's kind of giving these examples to kind of negate the findings of Mead and Tosman. Um, it's a good one. I mean, it's a good example. He's not going to go through every single one, but I think he's making his point, I guess. Given the degrees to which the deck was stacked against the successful replications, the fact that less than 25% of the studies clearly failed to replicate Putzman's findings can be seen as more impressive than it might seem at first. I think one of my big problems, I guess, with arguing, having been in this space for a while as like a racial expert, is that it's kind of like this fallacy that if you were to say get like all the studies that showed negative racial outcomes for like a diverse group or diverse neighborhood, would that justify would that justify racial segregation, right? Would that justify whites having their own space or blacks having their own space? I guess it would, but to be honest, you don't need to have all this data and bullshit. Even if there was no negative outcomes, right, for social cohesion, whatever that means among, racial groups, who cares? It still doesn't mean that non-whites should have access to white people or vice versa. You should be able to form a community based on whatever standards you see fit and keep out people, morally, right? Who you see fit, right? This is why the U.S. had restrictive covenants, right? And a restrictive covenant was an agreement that you had when you sold your property to sell to someone of the same racial characteristic as you. And this way you didn't need a bunch of laws or regulation to keep an area white, for example, right? So, but now there's laws against those things, so it just makes it harder. Still moral, by the way, and also even if it is racist, right? In my video, Introduction to Reality, I go over how it's not immoral to be racist, so it doesn't matter. The negative relationship between ethnic diversity and social cohesion has also been demonstrated in various micro contexts. For instance, Malzer and Dudgery, 2013, looked at 57,057 dyslexic, 75,000 people across nearly 400 churches, congregations, and found that being a member of a dominant racial group of the congregation predicted a greater sense of belonging in the church, having more friends in the church, and particularly in more church and participating in more church activities. Similar, Montoya and Briggs 2013 found that people reported having a better experience in firms where the customer service representative they dealt with was a member of their own race. It's funny. I have friends, right? I have at least two friends, and I feel like part of me being a friend is just kind of like people are very very they dance around the racial issues quite a bit. They're very nervous about talking about it in any kind of real sense, having a real conversation about it. And part of me just being a friend is just kind of telling them it's okay. It's okay to be racist. It's okay to prefer your own group over other people. And the one of the things that comes up a lot is countries with corrupt governments, and people move from there's black people that move from really corrupt countries where they're being oppressed by their government to white countries where they're still oppressed by their governments but they're less oppressed. And this we find this all the time with these discussions, is that they would, if there's two equally oppressive governments, they're so racist, right, that they would rather be oppressed by someone that looks more similar to them or is more genetically and phenotypically similar to them than someone who's not. It's crazy. But I mean, that just shows that they're talking about the customer service level. This is true at the national, the government oppressing the masses level, right? Because then you can't look up and point to that person being like, oh, they're oppressing me because I'm black or whatever. Finally, also it's because I remember when BLM started, I was talking to one of my only, well, I guess I have two black friends now, but my oldest black friend about Black Lives Matter, and we were talking about how the demographic that's most affected by police violence is actually males. It's not actually like black or white. But you want to divide among racial lines, not necessarily among masculine, feminine lines. And also, I think it's harder to form a complete union because you need women in your group if it's going to be a successful quote unquote group. It's harder. I'm amazed. I'm very impressed that like MGTOW, which is kind of like the male separatist branch of the men's rights movement, still exists at all, because they kind of actively kind of try to separate themselves from females. Whereas if you have like a racial group, you can still have females in that group. So it's harder to well, yeah, that's how you form a group, right? You can form families, form relationships, right, and form a cohesion. Of course, I think as men and women don't date and don't get together in modern day America, there is such a stratification of like a separation of politics between men and women, right? They live in like completely different universes in terms of what they believe politically, and there's really not a lot of compromise between the two, right? Men tend to be more are leaning more and more conservative. Women are leaning more and more liberal. So when they do talk about politics, it's a lot of butting heads, and neither side gives an inch. Finally, Dresden and Sondersoven, 2015, found that ethnic diversity within 80-meter radius of a person's home was related to less social trust. Kind of interesting. And I wonder, because people aren't in communities as much, they're online more. I wonder if it's interesting to see, because the internet's gotten so bad in the last 10 years. I'd be curious about that. Along with correlation and longitudinal data already presented, the negative relationship between pro-social behavior and ethnic diversity has been demonstrated experimentally. For instance, Glacier X al. 2000 has participants play an economic game in which one person sent another person a sum of money of their choosing. That money was then doubled. That money was then doubled when they sent well, wait, that's weird. That money was then doubled money they were sent, and the receiver had a chance to send some money back to the person who gave them the initial sum of money. This is a very basic measure of altruism, fairness, and trustworthiness. Okay, yeah, so they're going to double the money and you get send some back to the other, or you can keep it. Researchers found that the receiver sent back far less money when they were paired with someone of another race. In fact, 90% of the cases in which no money was sent back took place with racial diverse pairs of people. I like I said, I listened to stuff on Molyneux, right, for a long time of Freedom Aid Radio, and he is a more optimistic about the racial problems in the United States than I am. He believes not that all people are the same. He does acknowledge racial differences in intelligence and different factors, but he believes that without like the Marxists kind of like dividing groups, right, finding these fissure points in society and like pounding them in, that people would get along better, right? So I think he even used the example of Amon Audrey, the guy who grabbed the shotgun and got shot by these people trying to defend themselves. You know, that he wouldn't have done that if it wasn't for the media like ginning up hatred against white people. And I think that I don't know if that's true. I think that's an excuse, because I think that if someone has their heart full of hatred, right, and they're going to hate, like you because of the color of your skin, I don't. They're going to find a reason to hate you, right? It doesn't matter how much the media gins up hatred against you. Also, they might not be paying attention to the media. I mean, maybe that's naive of me to think, but I also feel like when people are plugged in every day online, reading stories about all this problems and everything, they kind of project their worldview onto other people, and that might not be the case, right? They might just be in their own home listening to their mother talk about how evil white people are and how they benefited from slavery and so on and so forth. And yeah, and she's not presenting them any data, right? These are just lessons that are just taught to them as a kid, and they just grow up with that hatred in their heart. Once again, even without those lessons, I think that reality would just may have made them just as, racist or full of hate, and then that leads to not trusting each other. So I don't know, and obviously this article doesn't go into the why necessarily. It just kind of presents the well, he presents his thoughts later when he's kind of trying to Iron Man his argument. But at least Ryan Falk here, at least he presents that. It's funny because I like this. I like that he gives like data that goes against his argument. There's so many articles that don't do that, where they lie through omission. Um, so I at least like that. That's at least something. It's not always the most useful. Sometimes it's hard to build a house when the waves are constantly tearing it down. Okay, so instant glaciers might double, far less than 90%. Okay, researchers found that the receivers spent back less money when they were paired with someone of another race. In fact, 90% of cases in which no money was sent back took place with racial divisions of pairs of people. Yikes. People on the benefits of diversity in work environments also show us that diversity makes people trust people less. This was finding in Laverne and Shark 2015, who argued that reasons that people in diverse groups came up with better solutions to hypothetical problems in their study was that they were less likely to trust one another and so less susceptible to groupthink and conformity. While this may be seen as a benefit in problem solving, it is also obviously socially detrimental. Well, it's socially detrimental. I mean, it's hard to hold a nation or a group together because of it. Um, which good, fuck America. In conclusion, the totality of evidence clearly shows that ethnic diversity damages how well people get along and how much they trust one another, and how satisfied they are with their lives. These findings should be kept in mind when thinking about any form of racial diversity, regardless of the races involved. Yeah, a nice little capstone. Um, and that's it. I think I've gone on for quite a while. Holy moly, only almost 40 minutes. I guess these are going to be long videos. I guess I can't help that. I guess I'm going to just talk and ramble and go on and on and on. But I want to do more of these. And next time, humans evolve separately long enough to have races. I should probably do these ones first. I might skip over this one and come back. I think these must have been from an old site, and maybe just brought all these over in the same day. Um, Ryan Falk, he was on. I don't know what he's doing now really. I know he's on Twitter once in a while, but he was on the earliest video I found of his is like 2010. So he's been on the internet forever, arguing with people. So yeah, some of his stuff's really good. He's also changed ideologies quite a bit too. I think he started off as a liberal, became just like me, right? Became an ANCAP, just like me. But why I've been kind of stuck at being an anarcho-capitalist, he kind of became a Republican, alt-righter, I think, and he called himself a first worldist, so he wanted to support policies that would, yeah, support, indoor plumbing, things that he considered first world country like has to have. Uh, but just a fascinating individual, and I think I will listen to some of his videos later. If I guess if he doesn't copyright strike me, and I would love to uh, comment on some of his thoughts. Really a really an interesting mind. Even if you disagree with him, he's definitely well put together, and also just like a biting wit about him. His response videos to Kraut and Tea, especially, were just fascinating to watch. He was so um, driven, not angry, but you can just tell that he really enjoyed the process of responding. And he has these facts. Like the way my brain works, I have to like dig for them, but it just felt like he was just able to spit off these numbers at like the top of his head. And I'm always very jealous of that. So all right, that's all for me. This has been Spencer McGreal. I'm not sure which platform this will be on, but like and subscribe, and look forward to more stuff. I'll try to do a video a day. Uh, I'll try to use less ums. Yeah, that's all. Bye.